Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Frank Wolak. I'm the president and CEO of the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association, and I want to welcome all of the attendees today to this, in some ways, an inaugural conversation webinar format in honor of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Day, which, as many of you are aware, this day is named after the atomic weight of hydrogen, 1008, and it was conceived by Fuel FCHEA and some of our member companies, literally sitting around a table thinking of a way to honor the industry 11 years ago. Since that time, it has taken on a global activity, and with activities and events around the world in honor of now generally known as Hydrogen Day. And today, um, you know, we um, we are here to really celebrate this very versatile and valuable molecule. And just as a molecule is really eternal, the impact of what we're doing in hydrogen is in so many ways is perpetual. And though we may be going through a period of change and adjustment, when you think of the time frame of perpetuity, we are very much at the beginning of what is going to be a very lasting and undertaking where we introduce hydrogen and hydrogen technologies into the world. And so it's really with that spirit that I am so pleased today to have this conversation in what will become a series of webinars. We're using this Hydrogen Day as a kickoff for what might be a series of FCHEA webinars on topics that are relevant and important for our industry. And I'm totally honored to have my friend and industry participant, Sunita Satyapal, who has shown so much leadership, and so many of us have known through her days at the Department of Energy, as well as her days even prior to the DOE, where she was involved in fuel cell and hydrogen technologies in the private sector. So we introduce her today for a conversation in honor of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Day as a subject matter expert and someone who's got a great deal to offer all of us with a forward look of where our industry is going, some of her knowledge about technologies. And so the two of us are going to engage in a bit of a fireside chat, back and forth questions, and hopefully we give you as our audience a 1 hour of really good quality time where you think this is a memorable exercise on this day. So with that, Sunita, I'd like to turn it over to you for a few words, and then we'll go into our format.
Great. Well, thank you, Frank. And I just wanted to say thanks for the invitation to be here in my personal capacity. No affiliation at the moment. I think many of you know I got this pin, H pin, for $6 on Amazon, and I'm also wearing my fuel cell shirt from the 30th anniversary of the fuel cell seminar, which was 2006. I was actually the chair at the time for that seminar. Next year, believe it or not, it's going to be the 50th anniversary. So just wanted to say a big thank you to you and FCHEA. And maybe also just before we start, if it's okay, a special shout out to Connor, because I think many of your participants might not know that he actually came up with the idea. And I think it was inspired by May 4th, may the force be with you. So the 1.008, and I remember, back at the time, 11 years ago, and also just before we start, a huge, thank you. That's the kind of the main sentiment that I have for all of you. And again, as a national association, way back with the U.S. Fuel Cell Council and Bob Rose, and then Jeff Surface with the National Hydrogen Association, at the time when it merged with Ruth Cox, and then Maury Markowitz, and you've been there some time now. So just wanted to start by saying thank you. Just the dissemination and raising awareness with hydrogen. Like you said, it's now globally recognized. So a big thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
We've got a series of questions that we've kind of designed to cover a number of themes, and we'll be going back and forth among each other, have a little fun with this as well, Sunita. So let's start. Well, I guess I really want to kind of open up with Sunita Satyapal as an experienced subject matter expert, 3 decades of industry, government, academia, global partnerships, and yes, as a former director of DOE's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Office and manager and researcher. Give us your sense of the hydrogen industry at this moment in time.
Well, thanks, Frank. And I think it's such a critical time in the industry. And I've been through various hype cycles and setbacks. And starting in the 1990s, when I started in industry, and at the time it was at United Technologies. And there's so many ups and downs, but I think it's especially volatile at the moment. And I know there are project delays, cancellations, setbacks, but I think what's really different this time compared to all the other hype cycles and ups and downs is there's so much global momentum. And so despite some of the setbacks and delays, industry has actually announced $110 billion in firm commitments. And these are not just announcements or plans. These are actual firm commitments, FID level, final investment decision level investments. And that's just a portion of up to a $2.5 trillion global hydrogen market that's been estimated. And as you're aware, Hydrogen Council and others have discussed this in terms of today's industry. And so I think, again, the bottom line is, despite delays, there's tons of opportunity. And I think there's interest, for instance, energy security, from the US perspective, energy dominance, resiliency, demand for chemicals, refining. We hear data centers. And we're starting to see um, the more serious players, the more serious contenders that are, basically making commitments and staying firm in their plans. I think, unfortunately, some of the others that don't have capital are not able to continue. And so we're seeing that trend as well. But fortunately, I think there are more partnerships, some consolidation, and then overall, I think steady progress, and especially seeing progress in other countries as well. So I think it's just, so the overall answer, I think, is this is just a critical window of opportunity for the industry. And I think it's going to be really important. We'll come back to the tax credits too, because as you know, there's a narrow window of opportunity there. So I think that, and I'll say more later on, but maybe going back to you now, 2025 has been another very busy year for FCHEA. And as I mentioned before, just want to thank all of you for the hard work, you and your team, of course, all the industry. And since Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Day, as you know, is often a time to celebrate successes, could you give a summary of some of your recent successes on behalf of the hydrogen and fuel cell sector?
Well, sure. Well, it's amazing to think that this is October of 2025 because the year has just gone by so fast. I feel like I'm still in January, but so much has happened. And I'm going to go back to, in a sense, 2025 really started in so many ways with in November with the change in administration and the election and trying to understand how do we bridge different views of energy policy. Yes, there have been some successes in the policy front. I think the starting point of success that I keep thinking about, even with my staff, goes back to January 2025, where we had put together the this year's 2025 Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Seminar in California amid the wildfires and concerns about closing the conference. So this year started out with getting nearly 1,000 participants around the industry coming together for what was a great session in California, involving the DOE, involving industry, technology, policymakers. That was a good start. From a success standpoint, the big items coming out of into 2025 had to do with retaining the value of hydrogen and the various tax credits that were started under the IRA, and working with the Senate to secure continuity of the 45E production tax credit, which was very successful, but also the incorporation and the storage tax credit under Section 48, a 30% tax credit for hydrogen storage, and then also getting a renewal of the investment tax credit for fuel cells, which, given the growth in data centers, the growth in AI, there is going to be a need for more and more power sources in the United States, and clean, reliable fuel cells, whether they run on natural gas or hydrogen, having a tax credit that's stable for 10 years is a very good way to insert those technologies into the landscape. So those three kind of policy successes are what you might be thinking of. Moreover, though, I think one of the biggest successes we've had in 2025 is because of some of the situations of the tax credits and the change in laws and the OBBA was FCHEA acted in many ways as a convener, both of our members as well as other people outside of our membership to try to focus and provide leadership on how do we tackle challenges that are larger than all of us individually. So I would have to say one of the biggest successes that I think we've had is being able to pull many people and different voices together and keep them focused and on task as we try to, assert the value of hydrogen into our policymakers. And there's a lot more work to be done on the education front. So that's my snapshot on success, Sunita.
Great.
All right. I'm going to kind of go over to, since you started talking about successes today, I'm going to take this chance to go back to you with, with the theme of kind of early successes. And, roadmaps outline goals and opportunities. You've been involved in roadmaps, and we as FCHA were involved in a roadmap. But once they are in motion, it's about adaptation. The roadmap just tells you which direction to go. But when you're on the road, you've got to figure out, how do I move day to day? And so, given the landscape ahead of us, what areas do you see as most viable today, and where can industry emphasis bear most fruit? In here we are in the end of 2025.
Yeah, and I think basically, as you know, and I think maybe many of your listeners know, there's just been so many roadmaps. In fact, the IEA announced over 65 international roadmaps just for hydrogen. And I was in Canada last week for Hydrolution, and I heard another study that said there are over 120 international roadmaps on hydrogen. So, many, many countries are interested. And in general, the roadmaps tend to set targets. They have a vision, a strategy. And as you mentioned, they have to constantly make adjustments, which is natural. And in the terms of, your question in terms of what areas are most viable, where I think there's consensus so far is in terms of the low-hanging fruit, which is industrial applications. And so if you look at today's markets, like refining, for instance, and ammonia production, again, the world produces 100 million metric tons of hydrogen. The US is roughly 10% of the global capacity. And what's interesting is when you see the recent reports of the binding offtake, so where the demand is, as we think about these roadmaps, it was about 3.5 million metric tons of firm, binding offtake agreements, which is great news. And 70% of that was actually for industrial applications. So existing uses like refining, ammonia, which is what you'd expect. And then about 30% for some of the more, emerging uses, power and transportation and so forth. And so as the industry scales, there are other challenges that need to be addressed, like infrastructure and, starting to see some of the other markets. So I think that's what helps to kind of set the stage of, how do these roadmaps start to get changed? So as opposed to, you look at very early on, especially in some countries, they focused, so much on transportation or light duty vehicles, and roadmaps talked about, having X number of stations and vehicles. And now we're starting to see, I think, this nascent market develop and more deployments and, basically modifications to get to scale. But I think maybe one thing I'll mention, because this is in a way a little bit the elephant in the room, which is all those tax credits, and especially again recognition to you and so many who helped to get the tax credits through. And you mentioned the Hill too. And in fact, before I get to the next question, maybe I'll just mention in the spirit of National Hydrogen Fuel Cell Day, the award that was just announced for Senator Manchin, who has also been critical, as you know, just the whole the importance of bipartisan leadership and helping to get some of those tax credits, the hubs and so forth. And so I think, especially just launching off what you mentioned with roadmaps, maybe I can ask you now about the tax credits. Essentially, we all know that there's that 2-year window, especially for 45V, and there's tremendous opportunity. And I think that's so critical to keep emphasizing, because I know there are, lots of challenges. But especially in the next 2 years, when you see that tax credit window, what additional obstacles remain? So for instance, whether it's policy, regulatory, or others. So for example, for hydrogen to really take hold in the US, and how are you and the industry working to overcome those challenges? Is it such an important opportunity?
Well, Sunita, we are going through a number of challenges today in the industry, not just the window of opportunity we have, but if I think of sort of put a business lens on it and a practical lens on it, the message that I have and what we're in the next 2 years is just get work done. Take the opportunity for those industries that have industry players that have got projects going, get them up and running, whether they're ammonia, methanol, hydrogen, take advantage of that 2 year window because the ability to go beyond the next 2 years is going to be dependent on the success that we can show policymakers, the job creation, the economic growth, the real hardware that gets put in the ground. And that may not be as broad as all of us had thought, 3, 4 years ago. But the fact is, if we can make meaningful input in the next couple of years with large investments in the US, it'll set the platform for talking about what happens next. But there are obstacles. One is a time window. You've got to take advantage of those credits in a window of time, get organized, get your partners in place, make the investments, start turning out product, find off takes. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And as far as like industry obstacles, we have to continue to educate. We've got to show the value of hydrogen as a contributor to energy security, to goals of this administration, goals of subsequent administrations, and kind of put a long-term view that investing in the U.S. hydrogen is not just a unique one-time activity that may have occurred between 2022 and 2027, but it really is, as I pointed out in my opening comments, the starting point of what is really a perpetual motion of activity. And so our challenges in front of us are really about educating and making sure that we can continue to get policy support. And I'll leave with one more item, that the expectation that perhaps government is going to be driving our goals as an industry is something that we're all awakening to realize that industry's got to take on challenges and obstacles and create opportunity without the expectation that there'll be a giant momentum of government behind it. Some of that's sobering, but some of that's also very freeing. And I think that's an obstacle and opportunity that we have in front of us. All right, now let me see what else I've got here of themes for you. Let's take a little shift over into some of the markets and technologies, Sunita, away from some of the opening and early successes. You have been a technology leader and involved in technology as a researcher, as a scientist, as a business person, as a DOE leader, and you've been at the forefront of so many advancements and seen so many things. What technologies excite you, and where are the challenges?
So this is a challenging question, Frank. And so I'll start with, I can go on and on. So I don't know if your listeners are going to hang up here, but as a hydrogen geek, and I have to start with that, proverbial statement that many people make, that you can't pick your favorites among all your children. So I'll just give you a few examples, and I'll start with electrolysis. And I think what's been exciting is the AEM space, alkaline exchange membranes. And so again, if you look at today's like PEM acid-based systems, they need to have a lot of platinum group metals, PGMs, because the acid chews up the PGM. And so if you go to the AEMs, and again, they're not really new. There's been work in this space, but they're starting to scale. So I think that's really exciting. And PEM as well. And we're seeing so much cost reduction, scale, modularity. And then the other is liquid alkaline. I don't want to omit that. And most of the market now is liquid alkaline. And there's, better dynamic response, a lot happening in China. And then finally, I think the high temperature electrolyzers, also not just solid oxide, but the proton conductors, great thermal integration, potential, for lower cost, better efficiencies. And then another that I was always really interested in, still very early stage, is the reversible fuel cells. And so it's not just electrolysis, though. I think the geologic hydrogen is really exciting. So much going on in that space right now. And that's a wild card, right? There's studies, USGS published information there, potentially 5 trillion tons of hydrogen, enough for hundreds of years of, for humanity, for power, energy. And then going to the fuel cell side, in fact, your former company was a leader there, and that's Trigen. So I've always talked about trigeneration. So again, for those who don't know, in fact, the Port of Long Beach has a system now, and using waste, sewage waste or natural gas, and co-producing power, heat, and hydrogen. So you have that value added product of, products of power and heat. And same with pyrolysis. So there too, you can, you co-produce carbon, solid carbon that can be used for battery electrodes and tires. And so that whole concept of, product that provides value is of interest. And then I think on fuel cells, and I'll keep it short because I can go on and on, but I think there's just been so much amazing cost reductions, power density. There's interest now, for instance, in drones and space applications, wherever batteries are too heavy. Also high temperature membranes, getting a little bit more in the weeds, non PFAS membranes. And then finally, I don't want to not say anything about hydrogen infrastructure, because people spend a lot of time talking about electrolysis or sometimes fuel cells. But just the carriers, I think, has always been of interest. So, besides just high pressure liquid, chemical carriers that can easily be transported to a site. And in fact, today it was just perfect timing because, as you probably know, the Nobel Prize winners in chemistry were announced. And one of them, or actually they worked on materials, MOFs, metal organic frameworks. And that's something that DOE, my former office, had funded. Omar Yagi, who's from UC Berkeley, who for some of that work, who won Nobel Prize. So I think, some of these innovative areas. And then finally, I would say not just specific technologies, but the whole space of system optimization, which isn't talked about that much, but, hybrid systems, how do you optimize cost, the siting, installation, do you need a battery for storage, the footprints, coupling with nuclear and high temperature, co-location, and then the whole space of AI, everyone's talking about AI, but how does that play a role? So I think just, to touch on a few examples, I'm sure I left some out, but those are some that I think I'm, again, in my personal capacity, I think very interesting. But there's still lots of challenges, so I don't want to overhype. They still need continued support and funding and, cost and supply chain, in some cases durability. There's still a lot that needs to be done. But speaking of durability, when you think about all these innovations and early stage work, basic applied development, some, de-risking demonstrations, the durable progress with these types of advancements really requires market developments. You need the technology, the market, the policy. And so what do you think are the biggest challenges, and what more needs to be done kind of from the market development perspective?
Well, a couple of things. I want to kind of start going back to your opening with the trigeneration, and because it opens up I think progress and advancements in building market development. We've often thought about hydrogen as being as a singular use. It'll be used in automobiles. It'll be used in heavy duty vehicles. It'll be used as a feedstock to another process. And we don't often think of hydrogen in the sense of it is either a product or an input in a co-production opportunity. And I think that as we look at some challenges in the market development, we need to migrate away from the sense of just simply building demand for the molecule and looking at the ways in which policy, technologies, and uses kind of merge together, and really go from where we are with hydrogen being viewed as just really an industrial gas to an industrial gas plus other uses. And as we start to go from that 10 million metric tons into other uses of hydrogen, you'll begin to kind of see that there's more to this than just the legacy of where hydrogen's been. And so when you think about the idea of co-production. You mentioned the trigeneration, but there's also even the sense of we think of electrolysis as being something that is a technology converting renewable electrons into hydrogen. But electrolysis also has value in nuclear facilities as a co-located end use. It's got use in the hydroelectric facilities to find ways for the production of the electron to be used when there's high water use and no electric use. And so it can be stored and converted. We've got, as you mentioned, the methane pyrolysis, where hydrogen is a co-product of perhaps producing carbon or carbon-derived products. And so I think as one of the market development opportunities and challenges is beginning to ask, well, let's get away from just saying we need demand, and beginning to look at the ways that the technologies can be co-located and aligned. You talked about reversible solid oxide, the trigeneration. There are many ways in which these market developments will occur by looking at systems of how hydrogen is produced or used, and some of that we're seeing in the and even in the production of ammonia and e-methanols, where the hydrogen is an input to those. So I think the more we think about hydrogen as being complementary in so many ways, gets us thinking about market development in another way. There are also challenges in terms of cost. I mean, we've got to drive out the cost of systems, some of that by mixing and matching credits, using technologies in a way that they're intermingled and adding value and leveraging off each other. And I think that when we begin to see these systems integrated and producing and using hydrogen differently, we will begin to see the windows of opening of market development. So moving away from just we need demand and beginning to think like engineers and economists and planners as a way to apply the business uses of hydrogen is going to get us a long way. Well, I think as we kind of go down this thought process, I want to kind of go back to you, because much of what we talk about in our industry involves a number of players. There's producers, there's equipment providers, there's government agencies, there's economists, there's financiers. A lot of that requires collaboration, coordination, many players involved, and in many ways, our industry is adjusting to changes every day. And this interface between public and private collaboration opens up opportunities as well as challenges, and we have to migrate to those models that work. So, like you maybe to consider from your viewpoint, Sunita, where does the public-private collaboration make sense? Where do those areas show continued promise, and what should we all be thinking about?
Yeah, no, thanks, Frank. And I think this sort of goes back to what you were saying about multiple end uses for hydrogen and the fact that there's so many possible revenue streams, different applications. Of course, I think it's important to emphasize that hydrogen's just one tool in a portfolio, and may not make the most sense for everything, but it actually has, going back to partnerships, I think there's just been so much solidarity among the community, like across here and globally. And going back to one of the first partnerships was in the 1970s when the IEA was formed, the International Energy Agency. And then more than 20 years ago, 22 years ago, the IPHE, International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, was formed. That was a government partnership with over 25 countries, the European Commission. And then several, more than a decade later, the Hydrogen Council, which was completely industry-led, global CEOs, and of course, many others. FCHEA has been around for a long time, other associations and partnerships, California Fuel Partnership, the Freedom Car and Fuel Partnership under the Bush Initiative, and so many. So I think they just play such a critical role. And when you think about, for instance, and again, in my personal capacity, but just as a taxpayer looking at the value of the national labs and industry and universities working together, there were several consortia and partnerships there. I think another example, especially with industry, and I think what you were saying too, in terms of how it's so important for industry to take a leadership role now, especially because we are in many cases at the deployment stage, and having those partnerships. And maybe one more I'll highlight is the Center for Hydrogen Safety. I always try to emphasize the importance of sharing information and lessons learned. Safety, HiSafe was another example. And in fact, next week I'm going to be, and maybe you'll be there as well, for the CHS meeting, Center for Hydrogen Safety meeting, and the AICHE, American Institute for Chemical Engineers meeting. And they actually started a partnership for industrial processing, years ago, and the Center for Hydrogen Safety was modeled after that. So with industry, labs, academia. So hoping to see some of your listeners there. I'll be there in person. And there's actually so much opportunity in Texas and the Gulf Coast, the largest geologic cavern, domestic, international exports. That's another place where collaboration is going to be really critical. And then I think maybe the other thing I'll mention is, to your question about collaboration and partnerships, is there's so much in terms of local and regional, in addition to global. I started kind of with global, but so many jurisdictions, and when it comes to siting and permitting and collaborating, accelerating progress there. So lots of partnerships as well. So maybe what I'll do is now pivot back to you and say, unlike many other industries, hydrogen touches, many different sectors. You kind of talked about this before too. And there are multiple opinions as well. So in some ways, I know I said there's so much solidarity, and hydrogen represents unity and so forth. People are real strong advocates, but many times there are many opinions, multiple opinions, partly because there's so many different sectors and even production methods and uses. And so we all know the value of building consensus, and but it can be challenging. And so I thought maybe you can talk about, how do you work to find common ground within your diverse membership, and just all the coordination, the collaboration with the outside organizations. And maybe one other too, I'll throw in there, is going back to the fact that hydrogen policies differ among federal, states, and regions from kind of that big perspective. And so from your national vantage point, what recommendations do you have for state or like regional actions? So kind of two questions in one. How do you work to find common ground? And then, given the whole kind of diversity of the landscape, what recommendations do you have?
Well, this one might take a little time to unpack. We've got a few minutes here. But I want to kind of go almost back to your question, because I think there's an origin here, Sunita, because I was listening to you talk about the sustained public-private collaboration. I think it's useful to point out that a lot of we think about hydrogen in our industry in the lens of the past 2 years, when we came into the industry, 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, or today, immediately what's going on. But a lot of the creation of public-private collaboration goes back to EPAC 2005 and the Bush administration, because around that time, hydrogen had research going on in individual companies. The labs were doing whatever they were doing independently. And in some ways, that administration and EPAC 2005 kind of forced more activities. It created the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technologies Office. It also kind of began the thinking of, how does organized R&D with public-private sector activities work together? And so we see the end result of that 20 years, but in some ways, this question of cooperation, coordination was disaggregated until early 2000s, when some of the thinking of hydrogen in the US needs to kind of get a bit more organized, technology coordinated. And so there's a bit of an origin to the public-private collaboration that goes back to that administration. But on your specific points, I'll go back to my kind of one of the opening comments we were talking about the past, this 2025. And FCHEA has been around for 35 years. We have worked in various forms with other organizations, on a regular basis, discreetly. This year really caused a lot of thinking about, how do you take a number of voices and bring them together. We were involved in the challenges to discuss the merits of flexible guidance under the 45V rules for 2.5 years. Many differing viewpoints of of opinions about what hydrogen should or could be. And FCHEA found ourselves in the middle of that, trying to find ways among our members and all those interested in the 45V credit of finding common ground. Um, and so it kind of put us in a place where we have to be, being a leader and pulling together people beyond ourselves, because you just can't have a disarray. You can't have all these voices going in different directions. You get nowhere. So I think we've kind of honed that a bit, and I think that resulted in some of the successes we had with keeping the 45V credits in place, where there were participants from within our membership, outside of our membership, all kind of seeking to get stability in our policies of hydrogen in early 2025, but there were different viewpoints of how we should go about it. I think that the finding common ground starts with a couple of things. One, what is the common mission? It's kind of like strategy 101. If everybody is driving at least toward the same goal or series of goals, you can then begin to say, well, how do we work together? And then the other thing is, what value do people bring? And there were a number of groups around Washington who had different vantage points of bringing access to the 45V issue, the Clean Hydrogen Future Coalition, ourselves, API, and we began to think, well, okay, how do we take our own vantage points and then work them together? And I think I'm really proud of FCHEA being kind of in the ringleader of taking those different organizations, and those organizations also being strong enough and mature enough to recognize that we need to have some sort of a cohesive effort. But they were all working toward that we have a common mission, and then what each brought value to the effort. So I think when you think about building consensus, it's, find common themes, get smart people in the room, people who add value, put your heads together, be tenacious. And that's kind of something that I'm going to keep looking forward as we have to tackle challenges in the future of repeating those sort of several items, both within our membership and without. And when you think of also members, even within a membership, FCHEA has nearly 100 members. They represent a lot of different voices. Even before I go outside to think of collaboration among different organizations, even within a membership, pulling together 100 different voices who might be large companies, small companies, startups, producers, suppliers, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, nuclear hydrogen. There's a lot of opinions that you have to kind of work through and sort through. So I think that finding those common pieces and getting messaging that is agreeable is a very good way to start, and it can be repeatable. When you talk about the state regional actions, I think there are ways in which kind of take a step back here, because right now we are in a changing environment where many of the top-down federal focused activities are going to be less in play. And much of that's natural because we've spawned activity that's now regional. So now there's a lot of, what do we do with this at a regional level? I think there will be coordination among national and regional entities about what makes good sense. How do we continue to work together? But I think that as far as the state or regional actions, I'm going to go back to one of the comments I made of focus on what's successful. Take the pieces that are started, take those elements, whether it's market development, whether it's hydrogen vehicle fleets for buses, or whatever happens to be working, and build some ecosystems, get them to grow, get some successes started, and try to tackle what you can without overlaying way too much complexity ahead of success. So start in small bites and build from there on the state and regional action. So hopefully that answered the viewpoint to the multi-part question, Sunita. And we, as we kind of come in here to evolving our themes, we've talked a lot about the industry generally, but it's been from a U.S. focus point. All of our questions today really have talked a little bit about the United States, where American hydrogen is and how it affects us. But we are part of a global set of activities in hydrogen, different technologies, countries vying for competitive position, taking this beautiful resource that we have as hydrogen and find the best ways to use it. So I'm going to go back to you as a real universal subject matter expert who's seen many things, and with a considerable amount of international experience in the past. you've seen development around the globe. You've mentioned IPHE, other activities. What when you think regionally outside of the US, what's accelerating? And why is that? What makes those areas that are accelerating be successful? Can you give us a sense of that viewpoint?
Yeah, no, thank you, Frank. And I was just thinking as you were talking about some of my early interactions, and it was over 3 decades ago when I was in industry. I remember visiting Japan, and they had the WeNet program, and they had pretty large plant at the time. They were de-risking the chemical carrier approach, so dehydrogenation of isopropanol, and they've done, looking at importing hydrogen, and so I think there are many examples, but I would say Japan, for instance, has always been a leader. They started with the hydrogen society concept, and Korea as well, and some European countries like Germany, where they have to import their energy. So I think that's one bucket when you look at a lot of the momentum and the continued focus where they just need either a derivative or some sort of import that they're focused on. And then, and also, for instance, Japan had started with companies like Toyota, and since Fukushima, I want to emphasize it's not just transportation. And some of your listeners might remember, but since it was such a long time ago, Fukushima, they're now, I think over 500,000 residential fuel cells to address, resiliency in Japan, and so Panasonic and others, and using natural gas, and it doesn't have to be just hydrogen, but natural gas and reforming. So Japan's been, a leader there. Korea as well needs to import their energy. Both rely on hydrogen. And then Korea also has Hyundai, so active, heavy duty trucks, but also stationary fuel cells, as you know from your prior, both of our prior industry lives, using natural gas. I think that's what's critical, like not overhyping the hydrogen, because the fuel cell space can be in many ways a stepping stone, using natural gas, other fuels, as we ramp up the hydrogen. And then I would say that, again, going back to um, what I've seen in the past, we've seen, major announcements, again, not recent, but, several years ago, Germany had 9 billion for hydrogen, France had 7.5 billion, other parts of Europe, the Netherlands and others. And then certain regions have a different vested interest. So for instance, South Africa really ramped up. I was there in 2018, I think it was. They produce most of the platinum in the world, so they have a vested interest in platinum group metals. And then more recently, I think various places in the Middle East have ramped up. So they have solar, I think most of your listeners know about the NEOM project. Um, and then the most recently, I would say India has been ramping up, and I was there a couple of times the last couple of years, and they have over I think by now it's more than around 2.5 billion for hydrogen, moving really quickly. And then, of course, the main one I think I'll end with is China, which has ramped up significantly. And they have now over 60% of electrolyzer manufacturing capacity. This was an IEA report, and almost 70% of global deployments of electrolyzers, if you look at, where these electrolyzers are coming from. And they're also ramping up in terms of trucks and transportation. I think other countries are starting to take notice. China is already the largest, producer of hydrogen globally. The US is second, but China, I think the 2020 numbers was about over 33 million metric tons. And so I think that is something that many are starting to take notice of, and is, I think really important, especially for domestic leadership. In fact, today's Hydrogen Day post that I did, I haven't been posting for a while, LinkedIn, but I actually showed some graphs in terms of some of the progress in China, and setbacks in terms of the US. So I think that's kind of a high level. I can go on more, but it sort of gives an idea of where we're seeing progress, and why I think, again, it depends on the country, the region, in terms of their main areas of interest. But it's an exciting space in terms of innovations and IP getting to scale quickly. And so what happened, for instance, with batteries and with solar, I think it's important to ensure that doesn't happen. in the US. And so I think maybe going back to you now, as the National Association, you're focused on, helping to shape the US landscape and with an eye on global opportunities, for hydrogen and fuel cells. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what are some of the ways in which international partnerships and relationships at this stage can help to accelerate US progress.
Well, one observation I'll give to that, Sunita, is that, when I took this job about 3.5 years ago, uh, what I was seeing immediately is that the launch of hydrogen activities that sort of came of age in 2020-ish, the combination of policies, technologies, global demand, um, was immediately international. It was not something that was just simply originating and being incubated in the United States or in Europe or in China. It was almost like simultaneously happening around the world. Now, there was forerunner activities and roadmaps and goal sets, but you kind of wake up one morning and say, this is not just a small item that's happening uniquely in one part of the world. And I think there's a recognition, and I've seen this within FCHEA, that we quickly, in my tenure, we realized that as I said in other places, we had to have a continental approach outside of Washington, looking across the country, but then, in a sense, global visibility, because there were so many things that are going on with member companies that are, based in Europe, based in Asia, looking to do work in the US. Conversely, US companies looking to participate and compete globally. You were immediately an international, it had to have an international focal point. And I think that kind of going forward, one is that, and we're realizing that as this market evolves on its way to being perpetual, there are going to be places globally where there's more opportunity and less opportunity over time. That's going to have a wax and wane of activity. And I think that there's, one item to recognize is that relationships that can offer opportunity in one region where there's more intensity of activity, offset areas where there's less intensity. And I think companies have got to realize that they can't just rely on one market, one area, one geography, that they have to maintain relationships that allow them to advance their businesses as varying levels of activity happen around the world. And as pockets of opportunity. Some of these things happen in forms of pocket of opportunity. If a region like Japan or India creates a market mechanism for buying hydrogen and it begins to work, you're going to see activity gravitate there, and then that will be adjusted by other activities elsewhere. And I think companies have to kind of realize that the radar's got to be up for where those opportunities are. As far as partnerships and relationships, I think we all have to realize that there's common data, common issues about safety, codes and standards, evolving toward consensus on what defines, carbon intensity. All of those items happen globally, and companies that are operating internationally need to be advocating for some consistency so that wherever your markets are, there are signals that allow you to operate in a way that that your product's going to work. And even some of that is things like greenhouse gas analysis and scoring. How do you look at hydrogen that has varying carbon scores around the world, and how do you get a unified way to track that? And that data is really, really important to retain, or else you get disconnects in the way markets are looking for compliance. So I think we have to recognize we are in an international world from the get-go. Relationships are going to help you to keep moving with changes in markets, and there's got to be consistency through international partnerships to determine what are the challenges that have to be overcome to make the market seamless, and then work toward taking down any barriers and overcoming challenges. We are at the 2:50 mark according to my clock. I want to leave a little bit of time if we've got some questions, but kind of winding this down, Sunita, we've been on the listening end of each other. There are participants, I think over 100 or so, online. And if you had to suggest some messages to our participants to enable and accelerate commercial success, what pearls of wisdom do you offer to the audience as they think of how they move forward in their own forms of hydrogen activity?
Great. Well, thanks, Frank. And as you were talking too, in terms of the safety, the codes and standards, one of the topics that came to mind was standardization. Again, the supply chain, there are such, custom-made components and really need to, scale more
Yeah,
quickly. But I would say that maybe the top, three messages are the number one is keep up the momentum. And I think it's easy, especially when you hear there's just so much going on at the moment in terms of setbacks. And I think it's so important to have that perseverance and tenacity. And I often use this example. In fact, when you're boiling water and you put, water, the saucepan on the stove, you can't just keep taking it on and off. And you need to you can't just get up to 95 degrees or 99 degrees. You have to get to 100 degrees C to have the water actually boil. And so I think it's so important. We've come such a long way. And so keeping up the momentum is number one. And then the second, I think, message is there's still significant challenges. I think it's important not to overhype. Cost is still critical. The offtake, again, where there's a lot of focus on production and we can't have stranded assets. And so that's why I think that offtake, the demand is so critical. Both need to be addressed, getting to scale. And then maybe the third message, since you probably have, many different listeners online, is to maintain the entire value chain of TRLs, technology readiness levels. So from, basic and applied research, the innovation is still such a nascent industry. And there's just been, I can't tell you, there's such exciting work going on, but um, there, really needs to be sustained funding, keeping up the funding and, not dropping some of those ideas. And then also de-risking the technologies and helping to, accelerate to get them to the market and, um, financing. So we just need that entire value chain. It's not just about drop everything and then rush to market, and we don't need any more research and development. And so I think that's an important message as well, kind of at a high level. And so I think, and I think it'd be great to hear in terms of your top two or three messages to webinar participants. Again, as we're all talking about how to enable and accelerate commercial success of hydrogen and fuel cells.
well, I had two planned, but I just think I need to put a pitch in that if you really want to try to be successful and find people who are all working together, consider joining FCHEA, because we're always looking to get anybody who's interested in success to be part of our kitchen table conversations and growth of the industry. But aside from that commercial message, I think there's kind of two things that I really the audience should take away. One is believe in your technology or your model. That if you're working within a certain type of technology that participates in hydrogen, it could be something that's got an advanced feature, a scale, a cost effectiveness. Believe that you have something and stick with it. Try to keep finding ways for that to work home. And that applies to a business model too. It doesn't have to be a technology. If you've got something that you really believe in, stay with it, overcome the barriers, and believe in yourself, your technology, and your business models. The other thing I think that's really, really important is focus on, tangible value proposition. Just try to find those partners that you can trust, where technologies have synergies, where you can look at the economics of mixing and matching policy, technology, efficiency, markets, bring them together. Look for those situations where there really is a combination that makes a value proposition versus just trying to go out and build like broad connections of various disparate activities. Focus on those things that just have a good business value proposition. Try to work hard around your technologies to glue those things together. Those are kind of the two things. Be practical and really believe in your own technologies. Um, I guess, Sunita, we've got a couple more minutes here. Maybe if you've got something you want to kind of wind down on with me, and maybe we'll have time for a minute. We got 5 minutes left, so your turn.
Okay, well, I think, basically, um, you were in industry at the time, when, the first hydrogen fuel cell day in 11 years ago. But if you could go back the first hydrogen day, what would be, some advice, one piece of advice you'd give yourself? And then maybe the last question is, what will the industry look like in 5 years? So
Uh,
5 years from today on Hydrogen Day in 2030.
let's see. Well, the first one I think is sort of interesting. That I think if there's anything, and I'll use this as a career factor for anybody who's on the call who's kind of young, and that when the first Hydrogen Day was formed, I didn't really have a sense of the degree of activity that would be 11 years later. There were a lot of pockets. I was in one vantage point of the industry, just kind of coming into this industry. I didn't have a sense of all the players. I certainly didn't have a sense of the cohesiveness of the way technologies will work together, the markets that could happen. So I would have to say, well, one piece of advice I would give myself is stick with it. That there are situations and positive opportunities that are out on the horizon that you cannot foresee. I would have never foreseen the growth of this industry, the growth of FCHEA, the technology advancements around the world from my vantage point 11 years ago. I saw elements of it in my own little world. I didn't realize that the big picture was much larger. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to kind of forecast into the 5 years from now. The picture of hydrogen globally is going to be larger. I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know where it's going to adjust, but we have got something that's starting as an incremental piece of the energy landscape. It's been in motion for 25 years. It's not just a recent phenomenon or longer even, I've been practically speaking 25 years. And I think when I look 5 years from now, we will see some consolidation of players, companies that find that they were better off together than they were alone. We will also see new participants emerge, just as we did with the independent power world getting created. There were companies that did not exist when the IPP world was started and utilities were deregulated. We are going to see new players finding niches, whether that's in e-fuels, whether it's in even the SAF productions, the use of hydrogen, the pyrolysis. And so there are going to be new industrial players formed around hydrogen storage that we have yet to see. So I think 5 years from now, we're going to see different players, more activity, and successes that we just can't envision right now. So I'm going to go back to you, Sunita. All right. It's been obviously more than a decade from the first Hydrogen Day. What do you see now that you couldn't even imagine back then? What does the industry look and what does the industry look like 5 years from now to you?
Yeah, I think I feel much the same way as you do, but I was actually trying to look up what I was doing exactly 11 years ago, and it turns out that I was doing a trip the first week of October to Los Alamos National Laboratory in Albuquerque. And so that was what my week was looking like. And so again, now as in my personal capacity, as an American citizen, a taxpayer, I want to emphasize the value of the labs and both the basic and the applied research. And like you said, we came so far, and going back to, and over 50 Nobel Prize winners at the last national labs, working with industry, de-risking technologies, besides, of course, the Manhattan Project. So many examples of innovation like LED lights and the first, nuclear reactor,
Mhm.
discovering neutrinos and over 20 elements, the fusion announcements from a couple of years ago, so much on hydrogen as well, going back to the 70s. And in fact, one fun fact as I was looking this up was National Lab scientists were the first to install a web server in North America, which helped to jumpstart the web as we know it today. So again, I think it's so critical to, as we look to the future, I think there's going to be so much opportunity, but I think there's going to be lots of global competition. And again, if folks want to take a look at the LinkedIn post that I just posted today, just gives you a taste of some of that. So I agree with you. I think there'll be lots, even now, there's hundreds of new companies. If you look at just the electrolyzer space globally, there'll be some consolidation, and I think there'll be some fierce competition. So I think the main message is keeping up the momentum across the TRL level of both the research, de-risking, the deployments, getting to scale quickly. And I think it's a really exciting time. And thanks to all of your efforts, and huge thank you. There's so many people I'd like to thank, but we just have after almost a third of a century in the space. I agree with you. I think the perseverance, keeping up the momentum is probably the most critical thing at this point. So thanks again for inviting me. I see it's 3 o'clock, so I'll turn it back to you.
We are now at the top of the hour, and unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. But I really want to thank everybody for participating, and I want to invite all of you to look at our website for future webinars. We're going to try to keep not only our members, but other industry participants aware of the important topics. And so thank you all. Go out and celebrate Hydrogen Day, whatever time zone you're in for the rest of the day, and recognize that you are at the beginning of something very, very powerful. And looking forward to working with so many of you on ways we advance this industry. Thank you. And thank you, Sunita, for all your time and effort with all of us.
Thank you, Frank. Happy Hydrogen Day.
Happy Hydrogen Day.